Inside every single one of us is this incredible life-sustaining system, our blood and circulation. And it works in this super delicate, really precise balance every second of our lives. But what happens when that balance is totally thrown off? Well, today we're going to dive into what happens when this amazing system breaks down. I want you to think about your circulatory system like a massive river. It's always on the move, delivering all the good stuff like oxygen and nutrients and carrying away all the waste. But this river can face some serious crises. It can run dry when there's a deficiency, it can get all clogged up from excess, or its banks, which are really our blood vessels, can start to weaken and fail. So let's explore exactly what happens at each of these breaking points. All right, first up, let's talk about what happens when that river's flow gets weak and shallow. This is the world of the anemias, where the fundamental problem is that we just don't have enough oxygen carrying capacity to go around. So at its core, anemia just means you don't have enough working hemoglobin to get oxygen where it needs to go. And without that oxygen, well, our cells are basically being starved of fuel. They just can't produce enough energy. And what does that feel like? It's that deep, profound fatigue, that weakness, and even that shortness of breath you feel as your body is desperately trying to make up for the shortfall. This right here shows how a bunch of different failures can lead to the very same problem: not enough oxygen. With iron deficiency, it's a supply chain issue. You literally don't have the iron to build hemoglobin, so you end up with these tiny, pale red blood cells. Then there's pernicious anemia. That's an absorption problem. Your body can't absorb a crucial vitamin, B12, so you get these big, immature cells and can even have nerve damage. Aplastic anemia? That's a total factory shutdown. The bone marrow just stops, and that creates a shortage of all your blood cells. We call that pancytopenia. And finally, you have hemolytic anemia, which is a destruction problem. The cells are being made, but they're getting destroyed faster than they can be replaced. This leads to things like jaundice, that yellowing of the skin, and an enlarged spleen from it working overtime just to clear out all the debris. Now, sickle cell anemia is a genetic condition that really shows how one tiny change can have absolutely catastrophic effects. When oxygen levels are low, this abnormal hemoglobin protein causes red blood cells to twist into a rigid sickle shape. These sickled cells can't just squeeze through the tiny capillaries like they're supposed to. They get stuck. They create these log jams that block blood flow, starving tissues of oxygen and causing just excruciating pain and organ damage. It is literally a traffic jam at the microscopic level, and the consequences are devastating. So, we've seen what happens when the river runs dry. But what about the complete opposite problem? What happens when the river becomes too full, or when the systems that are designed to patch up leaks go completely haywire? This brings us to the world of excess and clotting disorders. Polycythemia vera is a type of blood cancer where the bone marrow just goes into overdrive, churning out way, way too many red blood cells. And all those extra cells make the blood super thick and sludgy, kind of like a river turning to mud. As you can imagine, the heart has to work so much harder to pump it, blood pressure skyrockets, and the risk of developing dangerous clots or thrombosis just goes way, way up. This slide just perfectly captures the delicate balancing act of our clotting system. On one side, you've got hemophilia A. In this case, a shortage of just a single clotting factor means that even a minor injury can lead to prolonged, really dangerous bleeding. But on the other extreme, you've got thrombophilia, where the system is too eager to clot, creating a huge risk of life-threatening blockages in the river's flow. It's two sides of the same coin. Von Willebrand's disease is actually the most common inherited bleeding disorder out there. It's caused by a problem with something called von Willebrand factor. Think of this protein as a kind of glue. It helps platelets stick together, and it also protects another key clotting factor. So when that glue is faulty, the system for patching up leaks just doesn't work right, leading to things like easy bruising and frequent nosebleeds. Okay, now we're going to talk about the most chaotic state our circulatory system can possibly enter: disseminated intravascular coagulation, or DIC. And it is the ultimate paradox, because the body is clotting and bleeding out all at the exact same time. Now, the crucial thing to get about DIC is that it's not a primary disease, it's a devastating complication of something else. A massive trigger, like a severe infection or major trauma, sets off this firestorm of tiny little clots all throughout the body. This process just burns through all the available platelets and clotting factors. So then, when the body actually needs to stop bleeding from a small wound, there's nothing left in the tank. The result is just catastrophic, widespread hemorrhage. It's a system in total paradoxical failure. All right, let's switch gears and look at a different kind of problem: malignancy.
This is what happens when the blood cell factory itself, the bone marrow, rebels, leading to just uncontrolled and completely dysfunctional production. With leukemia, the bone marrow gets flooded with these cancerous white blood cells. The thing is, these cells are immature and totally useless for fighting infection. And even worse, they multiply so fast that they crowd out the production of everything else, healthy red blood cells and platelets. And that creates a triple threat: a super high risk of infection, anemia from the lack of red cells, and severe bleeding because there are no platelets. We can basically split leukemias into two main categories: acute and chronic. The acute ones, like ALL and AML, they hit hard and they hit fast. They flood the system with very immature blast cells and tend to be more common in kids and younger adults. On the other hand, the chronic leukemias, like CLL and CML, have a much slower, more sneaky onset. They involve more mature but still faulty cells, and they typically affect older adults. So, related to leukemia are the myelodysplastic syndromes, or MDS. In this case, the bone marrow is failing to produce enough healthy blood cells, but it hasn't tipped over into full-blown leukemia yet. It's often thought of as a pre-leukemic state. It mainly affects older adults and leads to these chronic issues with anemia, infections, and bleeding. Okay, for our final section, let's look at the riverbanks themselves, our arteries and our veins. What happens when these absolutely crucial pathways become hardened, narrowed, or weakened? Atherosclerosis is the underlying villain for so much cardiovascular disease. It's this slow, progressive process where plaques made of fats, calcium, and inflammatory cells build up inside our arteries. This basically corrodes the riverbanks, right? It makes them hard and narrow, which restricts blood flow and sets the stage for disasters like heart attacks and strokes. Now, the key takeaway here is this separation of risk factors. Look, there are things we just can't change, like our age, our gender, or genetics. But then you have the absolutely crucial modifiable factors, things like diet, smoking, and controlling conditions like diabetes and high blood pressure. This is where we actually have the power to protect our riverbanks. So when these plaques build up in the arteries of our limbs, especially the legs, we call it peripheral vascular disease. The reduced blood flow leads to a classic symptom, this severe cramping pain in the legs that pops up with exercise and then goes away with rest. It's literally the muscles crying out for oxygen that the narrowed arteries just can't deliver. An aortic aneurysm represents a major structural failure of the main riverbank. It's a balloon-like bulge in the wall of the aorta, our body's main artery, and it's often caused by that weakening from atherosclerosis. The terrifying thing about aneurysms is that they are so often silent. They just grow without any symptoms until they rupture, which is a catastrophic medical emergency with massive internal bleeding. Of course, the arteries are only half the story. The veins, which are our low-pressure return system, face their own unique set of problems. This includes things like thrombophlebitis, which is a clot forming in an inflamed vein, and varicose veins, where failing valves cause blood to pool up. That makes the veins dilated and twisted, and it compromises the whole journey back to the heart. So, with all these problems, how do we fix them? Well, it's all about restoring balance. First, we use diagnostics, things like a complete blood count or lipid panels, to pinpoint exactly where the system is failing. Then the therapies are targeted to correct that specific imbalance, giving blood transfusions for a deficiency, using anticoagulants for excess clotting, chemotherapy for malignancies, and surgery for big structural failures like aneurysms. You know, our circulatory system is this silent, tireless worker, but its health tells a really profound story of balance, risk, and resilience. Understanding just how fragile it can be is the first step. The next is asking yourself, what can I do, especially when it comes to those modifiable risks, to keep my own river of life flowing strong?